Hey everybody, hope this finds you doing well. This is Networkchain. Let's just go ahead and jump right into it. As you can see here on the screen, the U.S. national debt has now crossed over $39 trillion. And the issue isn't, well, the amount obviously is an issue, but also it's how rapid the debt is continuing to accumulate, as well as who is going to buy the US debt? Are we going to continue to see a situation where other countries, other sovereign nations are willing to buy US treasuries and things of that nature to help the US be able to balance their budget and be able to pay for all of the different things that they need to pay for, including conflict and wars and things of that nature, which is very cost intensive? Or will we get to a point where we start to have issues with being able to manage this debt, particularly with the fact that it is growing rapidly? We'll get into that in a moment. But once we start to realize and have a better understanding of what's going on in the macro, and it's not just the U.S. national debt, but it comes along with what's happening around the world, because other countries are also having similar issues and actually much worse issues when it comes to national debt. And part of the reason why a lot of these fiat currencies around the world have been basically debased to the point where inflation has gotten so out of control that many citizens from other countries are looking to other fiat currencies or other commodities to try to store value, because their dollars are basically worth nothing at this point. So one of the things we want to look at is not only to see the trend, which we're seeing right here on this chart. You can see that the U.S. Treasury debt has now reached over $39 trillion. And it really started to heavily accelerate when we had the pandemic. This is another outlier, so-called black swan event that caused the U.S. to spend a lot of money, and it also caused the US to print a lot of money. So that's when it gets to a point where you start to realize what really is the value of the dollar, the dollars that we are earning when we go to work at our jobs, or as entrepreneurs, as traders, all of these things that we're trying to do to, create the life that we want for ourselves and for our families. What does the value of the so-called dollars that we're using, what is that value at this point? Because we do know now that the purchasing power of one US dollar has decreased tremendously over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, however far out you want to go. It costs so much more now to buy a car. It costs so much more now to buy a house. It costs so much more to buy a candy bar at the grocery store. So we understand that the power of the US dollar is declining. So how do we find ways to increase that purchasing power? So if we look here at the US debt timeline, just to have a better understanding of the severity of the rate at which the US debt is climbing, you can see here, if we go even just back to around World War II time, the debt jumped from 49 billion to 259 billion, which was tremendous because of the wars, you can see, in the early 1940s. And then we saw that debt rose significantly, and it went from 1 trillion to 5.6 trillion. So $4 to $5 trillion over a 20-year time span. And that was considered a lot, obviously, during that time point. Then we had the cost of, unfortunately, 9/11, the Iraq-Afghanistan wars, the 2008 financial crisis. So that continued to accelerate growth over that time period, the first 20 years of the 2000s. Then you get to the pandemic, which hits in 2020, and we had a ton of printing of US dollars. We had the pandemic, and now we're going into, and have been now, in another conflict over in the Middle East that is costing the US billions and billions of dollars per day. So that's going to continue to rack up the debt that is going to add to the total that we saw there at $39 trillion. And so you can see that we had that $4 to $5 trillion uptick in over a 20-year period, and now you can see over just 6 years we went over about $14 trillion in debt just over a 6-year period of time. And just the last trillion to go from 38 trillion to 39 trillion, it only took about 5 months. So it's basically less than 6 months for us to add $1 trillion to the US debt. So now we're seeing that the debt is continuing to rapidly grow faster and faster. And so we're seeing that, as you can see, the major debt drivers are wars, financing military conflicts, as you can imagine, are very expensive. You have the economic downturns like what we had in 2008 with the great financial crisis. Then we had, of course, the pandemic in 2020. And so then there's also mandatory spending when it comes to Social Security, Medicare, and other interest payments that have to be paid when it comes to other countries and other entities that are buying U.S. debt to help us be able to pay and take care of the balance sheet. So that is obviously a concern. Also, once again, when we look at some of the debt metrics, you can see that the total debt is now at around 39 trillion. The U.S. added roughly 1 trillion over the last 100 to 150 days. Interest costs now are projected to be around 1 trillion just for 1 year in 2026, and that's just the interest payments that they have to make on that debt. We see that the debt to GDP ratio, basically we have more debt than what the country is producing for the year, is approximately over 124%. And you can see here that the debt amounts to roughly 116,000 per U.S. citizen. So at the rate that we're going, we'll be getting to 40 trillion fairly soon, probably within the next 4 to 6 months if we go at the same rate that we've been going over the past 6 months. So what are some of our options? You can see here, just to kind of hammer it home, currency debasement since 2000. River here has a chart showing that from other countries, not just the US dollar, you can see it lost 79% of purchasing power over the past 25 years. Japanese yen has lost over 50%, the euro over 74%, the British pound over 76%, and the Chinese yuan at over 96%. So our hard-earned dollars, yen, pound, euros, they are losing value. So we have to earn more to be able to create and continue to live the life that we're living. And that's just to stay at the status quo. So we look at something like Bitcoin, for example, which has a finite supply. And we talked a lot about this in our last video. There are now 20 million Bitcoin outstanding in the current supply, and there's only 1 million left to be mined. And those Bitcoin, it's going to take about 114 years for that to happen. Over 95% of the supply is currently outstanding. And so for the most part, this is what we have to work with. And so we see that the demand is continuing to come into the space. As you can see here, Morgan Stanley, one of the largest banks in the United States, they want a piece of the Bitcoin ETF pie. Bitcoin ETFs broke records last year, really over the last 2 years, because they came out in 2024, and now we're seeing that other banks want a piece of the pie because they obviously make money being the so-called custodian, essentially, of the Bitcoin that people are buying with these ETFs. And so now Morgan Stanley will be able to have their own Bitcoin ETF, and it's going to be set as MSBT is going to be the ticker. And so they've been making recent filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission so they can have that out as soon as possible. So it looks like probably sometime potentially before the end of the year, Morgan Stanley will have their Bitcoin ETF out on the open market. When it comes to finding and storing value, increasing purchasing power, which is what we're trying to do here at Networkchain and what we want for you and other folks who are listening to understand when they're learning and doing their research, we're looking at what are the opportunities. Obviously, a lot of people have done very well investing in stocks and various assets that continue to increase in value over time, because that basically they can take their dollar and maybe turn it into $1.25, maybe turn it into $1.50. And so if you do that over an extended period of time, then you can see that you're increasing your purchasing power because you're increasing the amount of dollars that you have. And so when we see the demand that's coming into Bitcoin, to us, it just becomes more and more obvious, because it's not just people like you and me, the so-called retail investors, that are looking to buy Bitcoin, but we see, as we mentioned, Morgan Stanley is getting their own ETF. We already know BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, they have their own ETFs. We know of companies like Strategy that are buying Bitcoin basically every week. We have more and more institutions, sovereign nations that are holding Bitcoin. We know of the Czech Republic. They're the first central bank to buy Bitcoin and have it on the balance sheet. So we're just seeing the influx of demand continues to come despite the fact that we're in a bear market. Bitcoin is trading, 40-50% from where it was last year. We still see that they're accumulating. This is a chart here that just goes to show that despite the Bitcoin price, the orange line is Bitcoin price, we're seeing with the blue line, institutions and retail are continuing to buy despite the price. We just want to make sure that you have an understanding of what's going on from a broad sense, as well as, our niche here, just looking at Bitcoin, for example. But we want to make sure that we have a better understanding of what's going on, not only, in your own localized area, no matter where you live around the world. Bitcoin is a worldwide asset. Bitcoin is for everyone. Anyone with a dollar and an internet connection can buy Bitcoin. So make sure to keep posted here on YouTube with us, as well as on X and Instagram. We post there nearly every day. We thank you so much and appreciate you watching. We hope you have a great start to your week. Take care. Bye-bye.